Prime Minister, you know what I think has been missing from the Voice debate, and that is heart and soul. It's become a political dogfight. How do you get that back?
I think you've just seen a lot of heart and a lot of soul there today, with the Premier, Peter Malinauskas, quoting Noel Pearson, that this is about faith, hope and love. And indeed it is about bringing Australia together. It is positive, and the great thing about today's launch that I found was how positive it was.
But you're also in a room surrounded by people who truly believe this. And if you look outside of that room, it's not so much. You've got a lot of people who are no, and a lot of people, Prime Minister, who are undecided.
That's true. But what I find is that when you talk to people who are undecided, and in the last week, I've been in Karratha in a regional community, been in Perth, in Adelaide, in Sydney, in Melbourne. Tomorrow I'll be in Hobart. And what I find is that when you talk with people, people do want to understand, they want more information. And Australians are generous people, and today I went through exactly what the question is. A lot of the debate's about things that aren't about the question. So when people focus on the very clear proposition of the opportunity to say yes to recognition, to listening and to getting better results, I find them very receptive to that message.
I've seen you shed a tear when you talk about this. I've heard your voice break. Why does it matter so much to you?
Because we're talking about what I believe is the best nation on earth, just becoming that little bit greater. This is such an opportunity, and I know that this is the opportunity for this generation to make a change. This will not impact most Australians directly, but it just might make life better for the 3% of Australians who happen to be the most disadvantaged group, the First Nations people. And I think it will be a moment where we can show respect to them, where we can feel better about ourselves as well as a nation, and where the world can look at us and say, yeah, Australia's a mature, grown-up nation that's prepared to come to terms with the fullness and richness of our history.
So support's probably not sitting where you'd like right about now. Why do you think people aren't on board?
Referendums are difficult in this country. You've had 8 out of 44 succeed. And people will focus, though, now they have the date of October 14th. They'll focus over the next 6.5 weeks. It's now back over to the people. This is a proposition that's come from the people. It's come from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people themselves. And I look at the courage that people like Noel Pearson and Marcia Langdon and Tom Calma and Arnie Pat Anderson, these Indigenous leaders who've spent a lifetime campaigning for recognition, campaigning for reconciliation and bringing Australians together. And I really believe this is an enormous opportunity. And I see as well the change that's happened in my lifetime. When I was young, the idea that you would have welcome to country at the beginning of every Matilda's game, and every person in the crowd showing respect through silence and then cheering at the end of it. This is the next step that I see in being a more inclusive country and in creating a structure. All it is just an advisory body that can give advice on matters affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people so as to get better results.
So we know why people are voting yes. They think it's the right thing to do. But when you look at the no and undecided voters, there are a few reasons. And the main one is they don't understand it, Prime Minister. And that is a big, big issue.
One of the things I said today was that if you haven't considered all of the details, ask more questions, that's fine. The booklet will be going out, of course, to every household, but what I would say, and I articulated today, was have a look at what the question is. It's pretty straightforward. The first bit is recognition, Then it says there'll be a body that will give advice, and then its composition and functions and procedures will be still subject to the Parliament. So it doesn't change the way that laws are made. It's not a funding body, it's just an advisory body. And like anything else, I note that a current affair, in order to get input from your listeners about this interview and about the issue, you've asked your listeners. That makes sense, just as it makes sense to have a voice, to be able to listen to people who are directly affected by these issues.
In listening to people, that is unfortunately the overwhelming response we get, is that they don't get it. I mean, and you just said then it comes down to that question. Let's break that down, because it comes down to 29 words. A proposed law to alter the Constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice. Do you approve this proposed alteration? So, I mean, there are the two issues in there, right? You've got recognition, and that's the first issue. I think that's pretty straightforward, and people are on board, and a lot of people think that's long overdue. But it's this other issue of the voice that is divisive, rightly or wrongly. Practically, what's it going to change?
What it will change is the opportunity for Indigenous Australians to be heard. And when...
But I hear that and I say, so what, hang on, have we not been listening up until this point?
Well, what we know is that if we have an advisory body that's able to speak on behalf of those local communities to filter up that information to government, government will still be the decision maker. But we know that when programs have involved Indigenous Australians, whether we look at what's happening getting young Indigenous kids to school in Arnhem Land, if we look at the health programs that are operating on Cape York, if we look at Indigenous Rangers programs around the country, justice reinvestment programs in Burke in New South Wales, the programs that have been most successful in overcoming disadvantage have been ones that have had that ownership, have come from the bottom up, listening to Indigenous Australians. And that's why Indigenous Australians are asking us, saying, yes, we want recognition, but we want recognition with the substance of having a voice to Parliament.
But I think there's this sense then that, hang on, is this just another level of bureaucracy or red tape in Canberra? Is this another committee? Is this another agency? We know these issues. How is this fundamentally different?
Well, it's the opposite. Because for 122 years we've had a voice from Canberra to communities with bureaucracy and with the best of intentions. There's been billions of money, dollars spent on trying to overcome Indigenous advantage, but still...
But are you honestly saying that we haven't been listening to Indigenous people up until this point?
Quite clearly we haven't enough. And we have had decisions made by the bureaucracy in Canberra. This is the other way around. This is a voice to Canberra instead of a voice from Canberra, and that's where we'll get better outcomes. And in addition to the wording of the question, in every booklet, in every household, I'd encourage people to look at the 3 points that are there. It's there in the pamphlet, in the first pages there that will come out to people, and it's very clearly here about the changes. And it says, in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the First Peoples of Australia. So that's the recognition. And then it says there shall be a body to be called the voice. Then it says what the voice will do. It may give advice to government on matters that affect Indigenous Australians. And the third is the Parliament will determine the functions and procedures and composition of the voice. So the wording will be there for everyone to read, to see themselves. That's what it's about. Nothing more.
But I'm not sure that all
less.
of that is simple and straightforward for people.
Well, I think it is pretty straightforward as an idea that has come from Indigenous Australians themselves.
But saying it's simple and clear and straightforward doesn't necessarily make it so. People don't get it, and that's a fact.
Well, people haven't had the opportunity to get the booklet, what the question is, in every letterbox. And that's one of the reasons why we supported the mailing out of this so that people could see for themselves. Now, every Australian will have to make up their own mind, and it's one vote, one value, and we respect that. But I would encourage people as well to have conversations. We know that whenever I go into a childcare centre now or a local school, you always have that acknowledgement of country, and often you'll have singing in Indigenous language, you have it coming together that is a beautiful moment. And I think that we have an opportunity here to really come together as a nation.
But I mean, we're not coming together though. I mean, I think we are so divisive over this issue, and it is sad to see. I mean, there is so much confusion out there, and that is something that the No campaign has jumped on. I mean, it looks at this point like this will not get up.
Well, I believe it will get up. I think Australians are generous people, and that is why today's campaign launch was very much focused on the positive, on what it can do. And it wasn't focused on what it isn't, which some of the No campaign has been doing, talking about things that aren't actually relevant to what is before the Australian people on October the 14th. And that's why I think it will be embraced by Australians. And when it is over, if there is a yes vote, that I sincerely hope there is, the next day will be like what happened after the apology to stolen generations, after the marriage equality vote, after when these changes have all occurred. There have been concerns expressed about the implications on every one of the occasions, going back, as we have said here in Adelaide, to when this was the first place in the world where women were given the right to vote and the right to stand for Parliament. And there were fear campaigns going back then. The apology to stolen generations, I was very proud to be a part of that. That was a proud day in the Parliament. It was resisted for a period of time. There was no downside, only upside. And this will be the same. There is no downside here. This is just recognition and an advisory body with no downside, no one losing anything, everything to gain from this change.
You say there is no downside, but I'm not sure that people believe that, because they're not going to vote for something when they don't understand the detail or they don't have the detail. So you have a vision of what this is going into October 14. But down the track, say you lose the election, Peter Dutton becomes the Prime Minister. He and his government will then have the power to change the composition, function and powers of the voice. So we can't say with any certainty what this actually looks like in, say, 10 or 15 years.
Well, in a range of changes when they occur. You couldn't, when women were given the franchise, you didn't automatically then have the situation we have now where I lead a government.
But you can't say what this looks like in 10, 15 years,
has a majority of caucus members. We're not overturning the fact that Parliament will determine the functions, procedures, composition. That's part of the strength of this proposal.
Is it a strength or is it a weakness? Because it sounds like then the voice doesn't actually have any power. What is it?
No, it's a strength. It means that there shall be a body. It can't just be wiped out. They can't have no advisory body to the government. And what we know is that people in the media, business, unions, a whole lot of people, of course, have input to Parliament and they lobby governments. What this will be is a permanent body. Yes, it might be changed by a future government, will be subject to legislation. That's important because that's what makes this such a generous request to walk with Indigenous Australians. They're not asking for another chamber of Parliament, they're not asking for separate representations. It doesn't change the governance of Australia. It will continue. Everyone will continue to elect their local member in the House of Representatives and have a vote for who represents their state or territory in the Senate. All this is an advisory body that won't have the right of veto. It won't be a funding body. It won't run programs, but it will be able to give advice to government.
You say you don't have to accept the Voice's advice, so you can ignore it. I mean, if so, I think people at home are saying, what's the point? If this is so important, shouldn't it be mandatory that you then act upon those recommendations?
No, because we're not changing the structure of our government. Here in Australia, we will still have a parliament that's determined by every Australian.
So this goes to the point, though, I think people sitting at home go, so we just don't see how this is different. You have agencies in Canberra who already have the direct ear of the Indigenous Affairs Minister. They have that direct line to Parliament. So how is this any different if it's not effectively been given any real power?
How it's different is that the power that it will have is the power of its ideas, the power of its representations, the power of its agency in going forward as well. And it will do something else. At the moment, when decisions are made in Canberra for Indigenous Australians rather than with them, the agency of Indigenous Australians is not present. When you have the involvement of Indigenous Australians, you will also change the responsibility as well. It won't be, oh, well, government decided this and, you know, we'll see whether it works or not. It will be, government's decided this, we had input to the decision. We also have some responsibility for how successful it is. And over the years, governments of all persuasions have wanted to do better for Indigenous Australians, whether it's a Labor government or a coalition government, but we haven't been as successful as we would like.
So how are you so sure that this is the thing that will work? Because you're talking about changing the Constitution. That is something that's forever, essentially, unless we go and have another referendum like this. So how are you so sure that this is right and that this will work when everything else has failed?
Because if we continue to do the same thing, and voting no is a vote to do the same thing, to accept that the current systems and structures are still working okay, that's as good as we can do. What this arose out of a process involving thousands of meetings, a big process established under the former coalition government, of course. Tony Abbott established the advisory group. We've had all of this process leading up to 2017 and then since as well, most of which occurred under the former government. And Indigenous Australians themselves have thought this through. This is a uniquely Australian solution to an Australian circumstance in history. And Indigenous Australians asked themselves, okay, what form of recognition, they were asked by the government, what form of recognition do you want? How should it take? And what they've put forward is a pretty generous request. It isn't asking for additional seats in Parliament or a right of veto over government decision making. It's simply asking for recognition in a form in which they will be able to give advice to government. That advice will be public. They will select who is on The Voice speaking for Indigenous Australians. And this is an opportunity to have that structure, which we have had in the past in a few ways, elected Indigenous bodies, but they've come and gone.
But you're at the end of the day, you're asking people to change the Constitution. You're asking people to trust you or to trust Canberra to make the right decision here. And I mean, no offence, but I'm not sure how much goodwill there is towards our politicians.
Well, I'm asking Australians to trust themselves and their own judgment. And that's why people who
Their judgment is, we don't get this. We don't know what it is. It's wishy-washy. There's this voice, but I don't know, it doesn't have any real power, it doesn't have any real legs. It can change over time and might look different in a decade to what it is now, and that scares people.
Well, that's why when people have looked at this, they've come to a positive position. Every faith group
But I'm not sure people who are undecided and who are no are people who simply haven't looked at it. I mean, my parents don't understand it. They've looked at it. their group of friends have looked at it and don't understand it. The majority of people who write into us at a current affair, our office doesn't get it. That is a massive problem.
Well, it's just an advisory group. It's not more complicated than that. It's an advisory group on matters affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, aimed at closing the gap in health and education and housing. We know at the moment there's still an 8-year life expectancy gap. If you're a young Indigenous male, you're more likely to go to jail than university. If you're a young Indigenous woman, you are more likely to die in childbirth than if you are a non-Indigenous woman. Child weights, birth weights, there's still a gap there. There's a gap in so many areas.
But I think we all understand what those issues are. We're just not sure
We
how this
understand
then
the
fixes
issues.
it. But I've got a whole bunch of questions that have come through from our
Sure.
viewers. And one of the main ones is, how can you be certain it's representative of all Indigenous Australians?
Well, Indigenous Australians will themselves determine the
So
composition.
every Indigenous person will get a vote as to who's on the Voice?
It will be elected. Now that might take, we had Tom Calmer and Marcia Langdon did a whole report. So for example, in South Australia, where they're having a voice to Parliament, it might be that that body then represents, makes people
Okay, so you're
part
not
of
saying
the
every
national voice.
Indigenous person in this country gets us to vote on who's on the Voice?
No, it will be selected by Indigenous Australians though.
But not all of them?
No,
Okay.
but they will determine the different communities to make sure that it's representative. And that's why that third provision, the primacy of the Parliament, will be so important.
Because I think then that's where people have an issue. If it's not, they don't believe it's going to be representative of everyone. I was up in the Northern Territory recently, and broadly the view was, oh, this is for the city elites. It's not for the people of the bush. And whether that's true or not, it's a perception.
Well, if you look at what occurred when I was at Gama and met with the 13 clans there in northeast Arnhem Land, they are all very supportive of the Voice. The late leader, Unipingu, was one of the authors of the Voice. He spoke about a fire being lit at Uluru and spreading throughout the land. They are very supportive. Indeed, all of the land councils in the Northern Land Council, the Central Land Council in the Northern Territory are very supportive of this change. And they are themselves...
As you say, there's plenty of support there, but it's not universal. Do you think the No campaign has jumped on the confusion? Because fear is the easiest and most effective political campaign. Have they got you there? Have they caught you sleeping at the wheel?
No, well, in referendums, as in other political campaigns, it is easy to press disinformation out there. And of course, social media has made that more possible as well.
But did you underestimate them and the effectiveness of the No campaign? I mean, you've been in politics for a while and I mean, you know how these things go. I mean, fear campaigns, Medi-Scare and work choices, borders, they work.
I was disappointed that we were unable to secure bipartisan support. I thought that the decision by Peter Dutton to personally appoint Julian Leeser as not just Shadow Attorney General but Shadow Minister for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs. Julian's someone who's been involved in this since 2012. He's someone who, that was a signal, as someone who was such a strong supporter of reconciliation, that there would be support for it. Now, Julian's made the principled decision to step down from the front bench in order to campaign for a yes vote. I would have liked to have secured that. Politics shouldn't be in the way of this. This should not be a party political event. And it is interesting that every single state and territory leader, including when Dominic Perrottet was the Premier, but Jeremy Rockcliffe, I'll be with tomorrow in Tasmania.
I know you've got the support of the
Premier
Premiers. I'm just mindful that
well.
I'm running out of time with you. So I want to get to this because, I mean, you talked today about a no and what that says with the polls, well, the polls at the moment are pointing a certain way, But a no vote is closing the door on the next generation of Aboriginal people, is what you said. In your opinion, what does it say about our country if the vote is no?
Well, I'll respect the outcome, but it will be disappointing.
Does it mean we're racist?
My concern is, no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. People will make their own decisions based upon what their views are. But my concern here is that the Republic referendum took place, it's the last one we had, was last century. There is no one under the age of 40 who has ever voted in a referendum before. And I think this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to seize the moment on October 14. And I think if Australia does vote yes, we'll wake up the next day a more unified country, a stronger country, a country that is advancing reconciliation, a country that's sending a message to the world that we're confident about the fullness and richness of our history. And that's why this is an important position. Putting a referendum to a vote is always a risk. That's why perhaps it hasn't been done for decades. But it's the right thing to do. And one of the things that I've said is, if not now, when? When are we going to get around to doing what every other country has done? Every other former colony recognises its first peoples in their founding documents.
And we understand your passion that you have for this. I mean, you took this to an election, but is this potentially, I mean, this could be a career-defining moment for you. Is it also potentially career-ending?
No. Look, this is about Indigenous Australians. And in 2019, both political parties said they'd hold a referendum before that election, and it didn't happen. John Howard went to an election in 2007, almost 20 years ago, supporting constitutional recognition, and it hasn't happened. And that's why...
But you have a problem, don't you, when you're 6 weeks out and people still don't know what the voice is?
People will focus, like they do in an election campaign. They focus in normally the 3 weeks leading up to it. And every Australian will get a vote. We will be giving through tens of thousands of volunteers out there on railway stations, making calls, expressing their views, making the information available, it's been mailed out to everyone. And people will focus in the lead up to October 14. We only had to give 33 days notice. It's a conscious decision to give a longer time for people to examine what is before the people on October 14.
If it is a no, will you revisit it or is it dead?
Well, I respect decisions that are made by the Australian people. So if Australians vote no, I think that will be a lost opportunity, but I'll respect that. You have to expect in a democratic nation the outcomes. And it is interesting this week, there's been with Barnaby Joyce talking about the fact that our Constitution, when people were sitting around at the end of the 19th century, the founding fathers, and they were all men, sitting around putting together the Constitution, they made provision for New Zealand to be part of Australia without a referendum, but there's no recognition of Indigenous Australians. In 2023, I sincerely hope that Australians seize this opportunity. If
they don't seize this opportunity, will you legislate, which is something that you could have done from the very beginning and avoided the division?
No, I'll respect the decision which is made. Okay. We'll continue to do what we can as a government to engage and to try to make a difference to Indigenous lives. But I think when a referendum is held, you have to respect the outcome, and I'll do that. Okay, let's talk about the referendum on the monarchy now. Just kidding. Just kidding. Thank you, Prime Minister, and good luck. Thanks very much, Ali.